Thank you all for coming. I'm Mark Cancian, and I'd like to welcome you all to CSIS. First of all, I need to make our standard safety announcement. In the unlikely event of an emergency, I'll give you directions about what we'll do. If we need to evacuate the building, we'll go out either the front door or the back door. And with that administrative announcement, I'd like to roll into our program. We have two elements today. First, we're going to take a quick look at one of CSIS' studies that has recently been published, and then we're going to have a panel talk about the 2016 elections and the future of force structure. The panel sets up, or rather the study sets up the panel because it looks at alternative defense strategies in a cost-capped environment. It looks at the kind of trade-offs that you have to make between in force structure to line up with these different strategies. Although originally the study was pegged to a BCA level of resources, the same sorts of trade-offs apply at different resource levels. Although I'm going to be briefing this morning, I do want to acknowledge my colleague, Clark Murdoch, now retired from CSIS, who worked on the study with me, and our research assistant, Angela Weaver, who helped out with the research aspect. Tell you what, Frank, can you pass me the
technology?
Thank you. All right, let's see if this will work here. All right. Well, here's the study guidance. You can see that it talks about developing alternative defense strategies and then looking at their impacts, the different impacts that they would have, and doing that under in a cost-constrained environment. We'd like to thank the Office of Strategy and Force Development for their support of the study. Okay. And what drove the initiation of the study was two things. First, of course, the resource constraints that appeared with the Budget Control Act and then in subsequent budget agreements. The other thing was internal cost growth. CSIS had done some previous work that analyzed personnel, weapons, operations, and showed that the costs of all of those were increasing faster than inflation in the economy as a whole, so that there was what the study called a double whammy. Resources available were coming down, and then internal cost growth was constraining the amount of program that you could buy. And as a result, DoD was facing a strategy resources gap. Here are the strategies that the study group came up with the help of a review group, which commented as we moved along. You can see that there are 5, and we tried to make them different to show different strategic trade-offs. The first 3 have some similarity. These are the engagement strategies. They're different in that one leans east, one leans west, and one balances globally. The next one is the counter-ISIS, and that's a strategy that that focuses on counterterrorism, global counterterrorism, makes that the top priority. And the last one we call the great power competition, and that's a strategy which focuses on competition with other great powers, particularly China and Russia, and pulls back from engagement. And my thought was that this might align with the 2 major candidates, and we'll have a discussion about that, so I don't want to anticipate that, and we may actually have some disagreement. But Clinton seems to be a global engager, talks about staying engaged across the globe in all of the major areas. Trump, of course, is less well known, but seems to talk about U.S. first and implying some pullback from engagement with allies, and that might translate into a great power competition focusing on building a military to compete with other great powers. To link the strategy and resources, we used a tool called the force cost calculator, and that takes about 80 inputs of force structure and readiness and infrastructure strategy, science and technology, and translates them into a budget. So you can go back and forth and build a set of forces to a particular budget level, and a set of forces and other capability elements that aligns to your strategy. Here's the force structure that the force cost calculator came up with for each of the strategies. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, because it's all in the report, which is now online. I'd note that the strategies are constrained to the BCA level, so that the absolute levels look a little low. On the left there, the first column is the current set of forces, and of course those are built to a higher resource level, so those are a little more robust. But you can see the kind of trade-offs that are involved. If you just take a look, for example, at Europe versus a great power competition, you can see what that does for the size of the army. Europe, being a very ground-based region, very ground-based theater, has a relatively large army. A great power competition strategy, which would pull back to the United States and focus on long-term competition with other great powers, would have a much smaller army. The previous slides talked about what you might call the supply side of the equation. In other words, that what you have available to conduct your strategy. We also built the demand side, that is the scenarios that you would want to use these forces in. We could spend all day talking about scenarios. I just want to make a few quick comments. We had a combination of what you might call major combat operations and non-major operations, some combination of long-standing scenarios like defense of the Korean Peninsula, and some new ones, for example, a conflict in the South China Sea or a denuclearization of Iran. We also put the scenarios together in simultaneity sets because DoD can handle any individual scenario. The problem is when you put them together in sets, things that would happen at the same time, that's when the forces get stressed. This is a slide that only an analyst could love, but it pulls together both the supply and the demand. You can see along the top there, we have the different simultaneity sets, which I know are probably too difficult to read. So I recommend that you pull the details out of the report online. And then along the left side there, you see the individual strategies. And each cell then is an assessment of how well that strategy and that set of forces does against those sets of scenarios. They're rated on a 1 to 5 scale, where 1 is an equivalent capability with the capability of current forces, today's forces, and 5 means that there's a major shortfall. There was some controversy about using that scale and whether about 1 being equivalent to today's capability, which might not actually be capable of executing the strategy. And I'll talk a little about that later. One thing we did try to do, and I don't want to spend too much time here, but we tried to take those risks and put them into policy terms. Very often when people talk about risk, they talk about it in terms of high, medium, and low, which means something to the people who have developed that scale, but to someone listening to it, it's often very hard to know what the gradations really mean. So we tried to talk about them, as I say, in a policy way. And to take 2 examples here, you can see with Korea, The risk there on the ground side is not in the halt phase, because U.S. participation on the ground side in the halt phase is relatively modest. The risk is in the counteroffensive. And I realize that the current phasing doesn't quite use these terms. As the Army gets smaller, you need to rely more on National Guard brigades, and those take a while to get ready, so that your counteroffensive is going to be delayed while you wait for these additional forces to arrive, and that's the risk. And on the bottom there, on Homeland Security, the risk there is that governors will hold back some of their National Guard in a situation where the homeland is threatened. Maybe there's been a serious incident. The governors may be reluctant to send all of their National Guard forces overseas. During the 2000s, during the height of the wars, there was an informal agreement with the governors that half their forces would remain at home to cover state emergencies. And although that was just an informal agreement, the governors might try to revert to that in some future conflict. We tried to also do a sort of macro assessment of the strategies. This gives you a little sense of where they came out, the pros and the cons. Again, I won't go into a lot of detail here. I just note that for a global engagement strategy, which might align with a Clinton administration, the big issue there is likely to be resources, because if you want to be engaged globally, you're going to need a pretty broad force structure to do it, and that takes money. For a great power competition strategy, which might align with a Trump administration, the concern there is about the allies and whether they would feel abandoned. And I think you're already seeing some of that discussion as Trump has talked about his policies. As we went through this series of trade-offs, some people asked the question, can we break out of this box? Are there some ways that we can obtain resources where we don't have to trade off these important capabilities? And there were a couple of places, but they're hard. One place, of course, is reducing overhead and infrastructure, and there's a lot of interest in doing that. One point that comes up pretty quickly is that bottom bullet that says that one person's wasteful overhead is another person's vital support program. Think about commissaries, for example, which many people have argued are not really necessary as a subsidy. Other people argue it's a vital benefit for our troops. What was clear, though, was that if you wanted to really save money, you're going to have to look beyond the Pentagon. There's been a lot of interest in Goldwater-Nichols II and restructuring the national security decision-making apparatus. And there's a lot to be said for that, but that does not save a lot of money. If you want to save money, you've got to go where the money is, and that's in things like the training base, it's in the medical community, it's in the Central Personnel Administration. Another possibility was to rely more heavily on operational contractors, that is, contractors on the battlefield. I would argue that they are now a fourth component of our force structure, just like active duty military, reserve military, and government civilians. But efforts to, if you wanted to rely more on them, you would really need to do that in a very holistic way to think about the policies and the trade-offs. The advantage, of course, is that in peacetime, it costs you virtually nothing. In wartime is when you would actually have to pay them. And finally, there was a lot of interest over the last couple of years in limiting personnel compensation. That may have run its course. The department has a few initiatives out there, but we seem to have really reached some stalemate there. There was a lot of pushback about reducing compensation. And over the long term, there's a limit to how much you can reduce it if you're going to compete for talent in a market economy. Finally, we had a couple of conclusions. And the first one, of course, is money matters. And I don't think that's news to anybody. But as resources came down, capabilities came down, and what you could accomplish came down. And sometimes I think there's a feeling that with $500 billion a year, there must be you could cut 10% out without noticing it, and that's really not true. Scenarios matter, and as you add additional scenarios, for instance, as you add a Baltic scenario, as many analyses have, that puts demands on the forces, that increases the demands on them and potentially their size and cost. And the last one was about nuclear battlefields. For about 25 years, the United States has not really thought much about nuclear battlefields because with the end of the Soviet Union, we were sort of out of that business. But now, many of our potential adversaries, the Russians and the Chinese, of course, but the North Koreans also, and someday potentially the Iranians, will have nuclear weapons, and we're going to need to think hard about what it's like to fight a conventional conflict with someone who has nuclear weapons, and perhaps what it's like to attack their homeland when they have nuclear weapons. Even during the Cold War, we were not really very good about thinking about nuclear weapons in the battlefield. So one of our recommendations was that we really need to start thinking about that again. And finally, I know I've sprinted through the report in the study, and if you're interested in learning more, there's the web address, and I encourage you all to take a closer look at the details. So with that, I'd like to move on to our panel. And first of all, thank you for joining us, Jim. I know you got stuck in traffic and you arrived at just the right moment. I asked Jim to talk about the issues, the problems broadly facing the next administration and the next president as they will relate to building a force structure. Jim, of course, has a very broad background over at CSBA, and we're very pleased to have him with us. And so with that, I hope you've had enough time to gather your thoughts.
Great.
Over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark, and good morning to you all. My basic premise is that the United States is really on the cusp of a major grand strategic debate that has been poorly framed thus far in the political campaign. The traditional approach that the United States has adopted towards the rest of the world is increasingly under attack both from the left and the right in American politics. So this morning I want to offer three interrelated thoughts. First, I want to recall the main outlines of American grand strategy since World War II and question its continued validity. Second, I will offer an overview of the strategic landscape and challenges ahead for the United States. And lastly, I will offer some concluding thoughts on their implications for American defense policy and strategy formulation going forward. So how did we get here? Well, it's worth looking back more than 70 years, but in the closing days of World War II, Yale professor Nicholas Spikeman wrote in the Geography of Peace, quote, "The safety and independence of this country can be preserved only by a foreign policy that will make it impossible for the Eurasian landmass to harbor an overwhelmingly dominant power in Europe and the Far East. The United States must recognize once again and permanently that the power constellation in Europe and Asia is of everlasting concern to her, both in time of war and in time of peace." Spikeman was not alone in his assessment that the United States would need to play a critical role in maintaining balances of power around the Eurasian littoral. George Kennan offered a similar appraisal in American Diplomacy shortly after the Korean War had begun. Today, standing at the end rather than the beginning of this half-century, some of us see certain fundamental elements on which we sustain that American security has rested. We can see that our security has been dependent throughout much of its history on the position of Britain, and that Britain's position in turn has depended on the maintenance of a balance of power on the European continent. Thus, it was essential to us, and it was essential to Britain, that no single continental land power should come to dominate the entire Eurasian landmass. Our interest has lain rather in the maintenance of some sort of stable balance among the powers of the interior, in order that none of them should affect the subjugation of others, conquer the seafaring fringes of the landmass, become a great sea power as well as land power, and enter on an overseas expedition hostile to ourselves, supported by the immense resources of the interior of Europe and Asia. Together, men like Kennan, Nitze, Acheson, Dulles, and Eisenhower embraced Spikeman's thesis that continued American engagement in the affairs of Eurasia, both in peace and war, was necessary for America's own security. Rather than retreat back to the Western Hemisphere and demobilize after World War II, after a brief flirtation with doing so, the United States adopted a grand strategy of forward defense, establishing binding treaty alliances both in Europe and Asia, and permanently positioning military forces, including new nuclear weapons, in both theaters. The strength of the U.S. military offset the weakness of countries still recovering from the devastation of World War II. America's preponderance of power was the decisive factor in balancing the land power of the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact satellites. But America's surplus of power had the unintended effect of stunting the growth of regional allies to reach their full military potential, rendering many of them mere protectorates under the yoke of the American security system. In recent years, voices on both the left and right have grown louder, questioning the security bargains that the United States struck after World War II. When the United States bears such a disproportionate share of the burden to keep the peace, or to restore it when war comes, relative to others in the world, does the Spikeman thesis still make strategic sense in the world we live now? To answer that question, we need to consider the strategic landscape today and assess our options. I would use as the starting point the economic consequences of the 2008 financial crisis, which continue to reverberate around the world. It was indeed the economic consequences of the financial crisis that led one fruit seller in Tunisia to self-immolate himself, sparking the Arab Spring that spread across the Middle East. We've seen the potential for Grexit to undermine the Eurozone in Europe. Oil price collapse has threatened many countries around the world and created greater destabilization. The so-called BRICS that were discussed back in 2008 in a Goldman Sachs report really are no more. All of them have had very, very poor economic records to date, with the minor exception of China, which has just seen its economic growth halved. Despite the Abenomics and efforts made by the Japanese government, the Japanese economy continues to be one of stagnation. Indeed, slow and stagnant growth is really the characteristic of the entire global scene, as countries adopt beggar-than-neighbor currency devaluation policies and quantitative easing. As countries lose their economic legitimacy, they are increasingly turning to nationalism as a source of new legitimacy. And whereas in the past it was the forces of integration and globalization that were really driving the world scene, today and since the 2008 financial crisis, what we see are the forces of disintegration. Two revisionist nuclear-armed powers are challenging the United States on the periphery of Eurasia today, Russia and China. Although they have limited prospects for alliance, they certainly can coordinate and exploit one another's moves across theaters. A number of middle states now hang in the balance. Certainly the North Korean regime with its nuclear weapons, an unstable Pakistan, and Iran that still seeks nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia dealing with both internal tensions, Islamic extremism spreading across the Middle East, as well as the collapse in oil prices. An unstable Turkey, a longtime ally that's now going through a period of great turbulence, as well as in our own theater, countries like Mexico, which are critical, pivotal states. In all of these cases, their destinies will affect our own. We also see challenges that are outside of the Westphalian nation-state system. The rise particularly of Islamic extremism as a movement, as it metastasizes and changes and morphs and changes shape, not only in the Middle East, but across the world. Closer to home, we have uncertain allies that are increasingly more inwardly focused. Are they willing to make the sacrifices for their own security and to make choices of guns over butter at home? The character of warfare is also changing, not only in terms of the emergence or resurgence of political and economic warfare, but the growth in cyber threats, gray zone conflicts, and proxy wars that are reemerging around the world. And at the same time, expeditionary power projection is becoming more problematic, while many states are modernizing or expanding their nuclear forces. To top it all off, we obviously, as Mark was saying, have great uncertainty at home. More than any other state in the world, it's the United States that will affect the strategic landscape of the 21st century. What course will it choose? Spikeman spoke of American strange provincialism. The question now is, will it reemerge in the years ahead with growing protectionist, isolationist, and nativist sentiment? So does Spikeman's thesis still hold? And what might be the options to it? Perhaps the United States would flirt with adopting an approach similar to offshore balancing, retrenching at home and trying to prompt its allies to do more for themselves. But it's harder to do that in an era of conventional anti-access and area denial systems, which would inhibit our ability to re-enter theaters in the future, as well as the prospect of going up against nuclear weapons, which fundamentally changes the calculations of war. And will our allies indeed actually step up, or will they simply just choose to accommodate hegemonic aspirants in their regions? I would argue we have an enduring stake in Eurasian security, and while we want to encourage our allies to do more, we really have no choice but to continue to lead. There is no liberal state or states that are ready and able to pick up America's mantle of global leadership today. So let me last turn and talk a little bit about some of the implications for U.S. foreign policy. Indeed, I think that the critical issue is that we're going to face more limited resources for national security over the coming decades than we have in recent history. Interest payments on our debt will overtake defense spending by the early 2020s, and there is no serious political prospect for entitlements reform. We're going to need to craft not a new single strategy in a quest for strategic homogeneity, but rather a family of interlocking strategies to deal with the heterogeneous challenges that we face. We must determine where we will control or preclude threats, where we will contest them, when they emerge, and increasingly in the future, and in a very realist way, we even have to be concerned with where we will just concede or accommodate, because we simply cannot be everywhere at once. We also have to think about how we shore up deterrence at multiple levels. When we talk deterrence, sometimes we just default to the nuclear level, but we also have to think about both conventional deterrence as well as subconventional or unconventional gray zone conflict deterrence. And lastly, how we will eventually craft deterrence in the cyber domain. I would offer that we need a new balance of power, a new division of labor between the United States and its allies, where the United States will pay more attention to thinking about deterrence at the conventional and nuclear levels, while our allies, through their resilience and their own defenses, improve deterrence subconventionally and in the cyber and information domains. We also need to adopt a more back-to-basics approach when it comes to power projection, as well as countering the power projection of others. We need to ensure that we maintain the most viable elements of power projection and ensure that our nuclear posture is one that is continuing to be viable in an age of precision air defenses. We have to expand our global surveillance and strike capacity to ensure that we can deliver both conventional or nuclear weapons anywhere in the world, and that we have a weapons inventory of both nuclear and conventional weapons that's sufficient to cover down on multiple regions of the world simultaneously. We also need to rethink expeditionary warfare, which is really the hallmark of the American way of war. How would this work in an era of anti-access and area denial threats, as well as nuclear umbrellas? Perhaps this means for some of our forces, particularly land forces, that we have to get back into the business of forward stationing in critical areas of the world. It might also mean that we rely more on land-based fires, land-based indirect fires, for how we will keep the peace. If so, then we need to reconsider some of the arms control agreements of the past 30 years, particularly the Ottawa Agreement on landmines, which might be very important for how we defend our allies, the Oslo Agreement on cluster munitions, which might be increasingly important for land-based fires, as well as the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, which prohibits us from fielding our own intermediate-range ballistic missiles. We also should rethink our command structures. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been a pendulum swing towards greater regionalism and empowering our regional commanders. But the challenges we face today are in many cases both cross-regional and cross-functional, and they're going to demand global integrative solutions. And for this, we may need to rethink our arrangements at home for how we increase our strategic thinking and agility here. And lastly, I would argue that the next administration has a real opportunity to harvest investments made as part of the current administration's third offset strategy to adapt U.S. forces. Similar to the situation at the end of the 1970s, where you had a number of new technologies and stealth, precision weaponry, as well as microprocessors that were just beginning to take form, we really didn't see the full manifestation of those capabilities for another decade or more. We may be in a similar period today, and hopefully that can be a source of continuity. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim, for that strategic overview. Next, I'm going to turn to Alex Ward from the Atlantic Council. Alex has been writing a series of pieces on the candidates' defense programs, and so he would like to hear what he's been able to divine about those, since there hasn't been a whole lot of detail.
Yeah, sure. I'll do my best. First, thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor. You know, the Atlantic Council gave me the portfolio of looking over the elections and looking over the candidates. And I think that's because I'm a New England Patriots fan. I have a lot of time on my hands to look at people that no one likes.
Can you cheat?
Well, so the issue is that we're going to head to a period of strategic deflation. So it makes a lot of sense. Couple of you got it. All right. Anyway, I'm going to basically more talk about the foreign policies of the candidates and sort of their general worldviews and touch upon the military aspects. But I'm going to do the best I can because I'm probably very much like you guys. It's really hard to kind of know, but we get a decent idea of where they're headed. This is a fairly military defense-y audience. I will put the bottom line up front for you guys. I think the main issue here, and I'll expand this later, but the main issue is that Trump will have the political backing and desire to increase military spending for a military that he doesn't want to use. And then Clinton is going to have the desire as well to increase the military spending, but won't have the political backing for a military she definitely will use. So we have already a bit of a mismatch in desire and tools. So let's start where I think the candidates are in their foreign policy worldviews and their doctrines, quote unquote. And we're going to start with Trump because, of course, he's so interesting. I wouldn't say Make America Great Again is the strategy. In fact, it's just a really bad slogan. The America First is really where his mindset is with world affairs, and I'm actually going to tweak it. It's not America First, it's America alone. Okay, I want to be clear that when he says America First, and forget all that Charles Lindbergh stuff, when he says America First, it's not just about isolationism. It's not just about retreating behind walls. It's America devoid of friends and allies and partners and working by itself to remake the way the world works. And the only person that can do that is Trump. So maybe America alone or Trump lateralism, whatever you guys want to call it. Because I want to make my point here. All right, this is not an isolationist worldview. Let's kind of go through the record. He's not necessarily against trade deals. He just wants to change them for America's advantage. Right? He wants to change the TPP and change TTIP and NAFTA and all these things, and he's going to make a better deal because he'll sit down at a table and they'll magically go, oh, okay. All right? He doesn't want to stay out of the Middle East. He wants to bomb the poop out of ISIS, and he wants to take its oil. He wants to take the region's oil. He doesn't want to cut off China. He just essentially wants to find a way to actively punish it. And he doesn't want to keep immigrants out per se. I mean, he obviously does, but he just wants to work with other countries like Mexico to make them understand the arrangement. He also doesn't necessarily want to stop being friends with South Korea and Japan. He just wants them to pay more for our services, and if not, help them find a way towards nuclear weapons. If that is isolationism, I do not know what isolationism is. All right, it is a very activist, unilateralist foreign policy that only he magically can enact. So again, I would call it either America alone or Trump lateralism, trying to trademark both phrases. But lucky for Trump, he has a party and very likely a Congress that will be very open to increasing military spending. And in fact, that's what he wants. His proposals have actually not been that much different than George W. Bush's during the election, his first election, right? Increase military spending, get our allies to do more, and just don't do too much in the world and be compassionate, except he's missing that last part. So this is not that much of a different worldview. We've seen this before. The only thing is that how he wants to achieve this worldview is completely anathema to the way we've done things since 1945. right? It's not the way he's necessarily enacting world affairs that's so abhorrent, although it kind of is. It's to the ends of what he wants to achieve. He wants to make the world not in America's image, but in a place where only America as a corporation gets the most benefit. And it's a different way we see the way the world works. And so, of course, he wants to make the biggest, baddest military in the world, but to what ends, we don't know. And so what I think will happen, though, and he's been very reticent, of course, to put troops abroad, right? He's made that case. I get it. I sense all of that coming from you. I feel it. So what's going to happen, though, I feel, and I believe in the perils of prediction, so I'm saying this take this with a grain of salt. What I think is going to happen is he's obviously said, I'm not going to get too involved in the world. I'm going to be very careful, right? We're going to stay here, create jobs. But there will be a moment where something happens in a Trump presidency, and he will be called upon to send forces abroad. He will, right, this is a fairly thin-skinned kind of guy. At some point, if someone challenges him, he's going to try to fight back. And the military tool is what he'll have the resources for and what he may end up reaching for. And who knows how he's going to end up using it, but he will be reticent to do that. So I still think we'll be involved somehow, but probably in an Obama-like way, in a very scalpel, somewhat covert, somewhat quiet, but with an occasional publicity campaign that we're doing these kinds of things. And if you're saying, Alex, this doesn't make that much strategic sense, I totally agree with you. All right, so that's Trump. I have a lot more I could say, but I want to leave that maybe for the Q&A or the discussion. For Clinton, I mean, this one's a little bit easier, so I'll spend less time. She's got a clear track record. We know where she's coming from, and she's fairly friendly with the military brass and just with the military tool in general. I think Mark Landler said it best in Alter Egos, and if you haven't read the book, I suggest you do. He says, quote, that Clinton believes that the calculated use of military power is vital to defending national interests, and that American intervention does more good than harm, and that the writ of the United States properly reaches into the writ of any dark corner of the world. Interestingly, that last part is a George W. Bush phrase. So she does have a set of impulses about the world and the way the world works. And I don't say she has a clear doctrine per se, but she does have a clear set of impulses. And that is that she believes in multilateralism. She dislikes Russia, definitely more than Trump, but probably not as much as the DNC right now. She's willing to use military power to establish a no-fly zone in Syria and maybe even a refugee-safe zone. She thinks interventions like Libya were a good idea. She likes NATO. Pretty fair, straightforward point. So all of these add up to an idea, which he said yesterday at VFW, of American exceptionalism and a belief in America's ability to lead. The problem is that she's a bit beyond her party, especially at this moment. Right? She definitely is a bit more out there in terms of military intervention, in terms of military spending, and with this progressive movement that's happening, especially within the Democratic Party, she's going to have a lot more trouble gaining the ability to resource the military tool as much as she might want. And of course, this is also a problem because she's probably more likely, I would argue, than Trump to use the military tool. So I'll stop there, and again, I can leave some more for later. What I will say, though, is there's a bit of an X factor, and a little bit of what I do is focus on the history of veterans and presidents and how they treat veterans. There has been a pretty straight correlation. No correlation doesn't equal causation, but a fairly straight correlation between how presidents treat veterans and veteran care and kind of how they think about the military tool. It's not 100% correlated, but there is some. And if you care about veterans aspects at all, if you care about how certain political members treat veterans, Trump's not your guy. And I'm not saying this is a partisan statement. It's just true. I can go through the record. Remember what he said about John McCain. Let's just start there, and I'll let you look that up if you haven't heard it yet. He's pretty much ruined the lives of some veterans at Trump University and a Trump shuttle, his long-lived airline. He had a hotline for veterans where veterans were supposed to call in and give their thoughts on how to improve veteran care, and it ended up being an infomercial. They called in, and it was Trump's voice saying, "Thanks for calling." They didn't get their voice through. In the 1990s, he lobbied the New York State legislature to ban disabled veterans from working as street vendors on his block. And he said that his 1986 life was just like that of a Vietnam vet because it was so tough. So, yeah, I'll let that one sit for a second. So, if you care about the military tool or how it's going to be used or how a leader will see the U.S. military forces, you have one candidate who seems pretty disrespectful towards them but doesn't want to use them, and that probably explains why most military folks, especially the enlisted, are actually more favorable towards Trump than Clinton, almost by a 2-to-1 margin. And you've got Clinton, who very likely wants to put them out into the field, probably more often, but has at least a track record of caring about veterans and caring about troops and talking with military brass who can give her a lot more context. And so what does this mean for when it comes to issues of Russia and China and North Korea? I think I'll let my colleagues talk more about that, and I can speak to that as well more in the panel discussion, but I think I'll leave it there. And again, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Alex. Wrapping up, we have Frank Hoffman from NDU, strategist extraordinaire, who's written about both the strategic side and the political side. So,
thank you very
Frank,
much. I'm also the only government representative on the panel, and I'm required to say that I am not speaking for any prior administration I have worked on, the current administration, or any future administration that may attempt to offer me a job, which I will refuse to take. So we have that off the record. I'm very impressed with this report and very happy to be here. For those of you who are not members of the secretive defense Illuminati, this report will come across as very arcane, because it's very complex and it's very sophisticated. The issues that it addresses between strategy, risk assessment, strategy development, force design, force posture, resourcing is a very sophisticated, very complex problem. And this report does it about as well as any report I've seen in Washington, D.C. In many respects, it has pulled back the curtain on the Oz that many of us have lived in the Pentagon. When you pull this one back, instead of one wizard, there's two, there's Clark and Mark. But a lot of us have lived in this world for a long time, and I haven't seen anybody do with the level of conciseness and clarity that this report delivers such a force structure and strategy alignment exercise. In fact, if I was teaching a course in college, I might actually use this as sort of the culminating exercise, because strategic options, risk management, force design, or putting it all together with regional studies, this could be sort of a core element of a course. If you were doing a 700 level grad school, for those of you who are professors in the room or think like I who have to teach classes, this would be an excellent vehicle, I think, to use. So my hat's off to the team that put it together. I'd like to talk about the strategy and the recommendations and kind of relate a little bit to the debates we have in town. So there's 5 strategies in the presentation here. There's the global engagement strategy. That's the strategy I think was operative from 91 to 2011. And our overcommitment overseas and the financial crisis, I think, combined to create the storm that pushed that strategy away. But that's a strategy that basically doesn't have to make choices. We see global problems. We want to be a global leader, and we want to engage with everybody, everywhere, all the time. And that's a strategy that we may still have a lot of will for in this town, but we quite frankly don't have the wallet for. And we have to make hard choices and make some choices, and that's what the report, I think, kind of teases out. I agree with the need. I don't expect to see a lot of money come in. There's a lot of talk. People would like to sustain our role in the world. They'd like to be everywhere. They'd like to put a lot of money in rebuilding America's military. They'll talk about taking care of the troops. They'll talk about having the world's finest military. They'll talk about taking veterans. And then the details will get very, very vague. To include, I think, Mr. Trump's in some of his speeches, he's talked about the cuts we've induced, but he hasn't put out numbers for the things he'd like to build to. So I don't think he's part of the collective engagement community. Then we have 3 strategies that I would call all variations of one theme. The second, third, and fourth strategies are basically what I would call selective engagement, a well-known grand strategy and defense strategy for the United States. And what varies in those 3, the Asia, the Europe, and the violent extremism, is the geographic focus of those particular strategies. So the second strategy is the Asia engagement strategy, which I believe is the operative strategy in this country since the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, and the pivot or rebalancing, however you want to articulate that, to Asia. I think that's the operative strategy, and I think we're still transitioning to it, and it's probably transmogrified due to reality of what's going on in Russia and what's going on in the Middle East. But I believe the Asia first engagement strategy is the operative strategy, and I believe it's Mrs. Clinton's personal strategy as we go forward. The party may not articulate it in that sense out of sensitivities to other things going on, but I think that's the operative strategy that we have. The second strategy is the European engagement. Clearly, for those who think that Russia in the near to mid-range is the greatest disorder or threat to order in the world, you might come down for that particular strategy. I don't know anybody who's particularly an advocate of that particular form of engagement, but I think there are some folks in the NATO area who would like that to be our strategy. And the third one, of course, is this Middle East or violent extremism, and I would call it the Middle East one rather than violent extremism, which is a global phenomenon, but I don't think it's the same as a global threat. The principal source, the principal challenge is in the Middle East. And people would argue that that's not as major as some make it out. Mr. Trump's speeches have made it out to at least to be the near-term priority for him, but maybe not the long-term priority. But I don't think you just look in terms of violent extremism. A lot of the extremism that's in that region is state-sponsored. Our friends in Tehran are not the negotiators and have not turned a page over in terms of the malign behaviors and interests that they have in that region. So I still think that's a viable area of interest for us where we have interests at risk and we have friends at risk that we need to consider. But those three are really selective engagements with a geographic focus. And they also basically have a functional focus with them. If you're an Asia first person, you might, as a defense guidance does, be inclined to put a premium on naval and aerospace forces in that particular regime because you see a lot of blue water in that map. If you believe Europe is the most important region, that Russia is the greatest threat to order, you might have a more expeditionary combined arms kind of focus where you think that the combination of ground power and air power is the most important form to reestablish conventional deterrence. And if you believe that the Middle East is the greatest threat and violent extremism poses a global or international challenge, you might believe that ISR, intelligence, drones, and soft forces are the mechanism for operating in that area. So again, you tease out these specific choices about what strategy you think you can go for. Now, the fifth strategy is the most interesting one, the global competition one, and I kind of peg that as sort of the retrench now to rebuild later, where you admit that our allies are getting older, they're poor, they're smaller, they're not contributing to their own defense. We have a longer range threat, perhaps it's Asia, perhaps it's a combination of Euro and Asia challenges, and that you need to husband resources and not just keep your powder dry, you need to reinvest. And that you need to invest in the disruptive breakthrough technologies that you believe are going to allow us to have a competitive advantage, reestablish conventional deterrence, and make all the challenges that Jim has so eloquently laid out that face us. Again, this disparity we have right now between our strategy of global leadership and a resource base that's probably moving away from it and putting those things closer together. So I don't think Mr. Trump is an advocate of the global competition school. Which is a tad isolationist in its execution. It would focus on our own borders and less on other people's borders. It would be less engaged. We'd have less forward presence, particularly in the near and mid-range. Forces would be withdrawn. We would not be engaged. So it's a little bit of the restraint and retrenchment school in something, and it could actually be a mask for that school, and where you say, well, I need to have the resources, I'm going to invest in technologies, I've got to invest in R&D, long-range capabilities are going to break through. It could be a way of masking a withdrawal or an element. I agree that the Trump campaign is certainly not isolationist, but they could use this disciplined retrenchment to rebuild school to kind of mask a pulling back. It's very similar, I think, in some respects to the offshore balancing school. And I agree with Jim wholeheartedly in the article that he and Elbridge Colby put out in the American Interest. Offshore balancing or retrenchment is not a strategy that's going to help our interests at all. In fact, I think it cedes our initiative, it abandons our friends, it accelerates the disintegration of order that's going on in some regions, particularly in the Middle East and perhaps in Europe. It's an abdication of any influence we might have and makes us extremely reactive. It's not a strategy, I think, that's in our best interest. It's not a strategy that would make America great again. It's a strategy that would make us just simply less influential and less relevant in the world. So with respect to the recommendations, there's 4 recommendations. I think they're alliterative, although Mark did not write them as such. So it deals with risk, realism, range of scenarios, and resources. And I think all 4 recommendations are very warranted. I might actually even extend them a little bit. With respect to the risk on our strategy, I think most of us agree that there's too much of a gap and a growing gap between the strategy and the resources we put against it. We're quite frankly a little bit too optimistic about what's going on in the world, and I think we need to wake up to that. We probably, in words of General Dempsey, need to realize that the wars we're facing would be harder, they would be longer, and it'd be much more difficult to terminate on degree of our advantage that we would like to see from some of these conflicts. And so we need to accept that risk and understand that risk. So again, I concur with the report. With respect to the realism of scenarios, again, it's kind of the same issues. Harder scenarios, more sophisticated scenarios, the cyber dimension, the nuclear dimension is something that we need to consider much more. The report spends a little bit of time on the North Korea scenario, and I fully agree with it. Often, sometimes in some communities of interest that I deal with and stakeholders in town, North Korea is too often used as a justification for a very large response, as a force structure justification for some of the services. I don't think this scenario in execution really serves as that. China's interests, I don't think are going to allow us to have carte blanche the way we've kind of planned for that in the previous generation. So the chem, the SOF, the cyber, and the humanitarian disaster are more of an interest, and I think we need to reflect that in our plans, and particularly China's interest in what it will permit us to do or what we'll have to do to get engaged in that. With respect to the range of scenarios, so there's an endorsement of a two-war strategy. We kind of walked away from that a bit. Right now, the current policy is we want to have enough force structure to win in one war, and in the second conflict, we're going to punish somebody enough that we can deny them from having their objectives, quickly, sort of the win-deny. So I'm an advocate of a two-win strategy, particularly when you have allies in two different parts of the world. You can't afford to tell somebody that you're going to help them, but everybody else, we're going to have to destroy their village in order to save it, which is how I read a second war, which you can only punish. And it leads to a technological dimension I think is unbalanced and is not very useful for deterrence. So I'm all in favor for a 2 MTW, but again, what kind of wars are those two wars? They might not be two conventional wars. We need to be honest about the complexity of those conflicts. And I think we must be much more realistic about what allies can and can't do in those scenarios when we expand those out. Mark talked a little bit about this fourth recommendation about the relief of the resource pressures that we face. And this is one of my areas that I share with Mark, some disappointment in the defense reform movement and agenda. I think when we started, we talked about layers, we talked about excess overhead, we talked about BRACs, we talked about duplication in capabilities and roles and missions between excessive amounts of headquarters, clarity about roles in the cyber dimension where everybody's got a cyber force, Space Command, we have multiple space, multiple strategic communication, we have a lot of redundancy and capabilities. That element of the defense reform movement I think has been diluted as we get into acquisition reform, personnel reform, and some other areas. I haven't seen the same degree of attention, despite a rather thick report, that really gets to some of the resource issues. With the exception of cutting 25% of the generals and a lot of the SCSers, which some of us look at as a useful jobs program for our future. So, but that's actually when you get down to literally pennies on a very, very large Pentagon budget and a very large gap, I think, between what we want to have. So a lot more attention, I believe, to relieving this resource pressure is necessary. It would be nice if there's a little bit of uplift in the TOA line. I think some of the OCO money over time will be a part of the regular budget, and that should be the upper ceiling for what we consider in force planning. I don't think outside of the bubble of Washington, D.C., that there is a strong element in the American polity that's going to see defense spending get back up above 3% of GDP, certainly not 4% of GDP. We're going to have to be as efficient as we possibly can, and we're going to have to work with our allies and be realistic about that and plan that. So if I had a fifth R to add to that conversation, it would be a reform of the reserves and maybe a reform or some reformation with our allies about divisions of labor and defense planning. I think on the reserves, we count a lot on our reserves. Mark and I are both retired reserve officers. We're a little bit sensitive to that community. I think we need to be realistic about what the reserve component can deliver, and then we ought to set up a degree of rigor in that analysis. The degree of responsiveness to the war plans, the readiness levels we assign for those reserves, and the resources to bring them about, maybe to moving that weeks and months to the left in terms of response time, is something that I don't think the commissions that have been set up lately have really dealt with the level of rigor that I'd like to have. Again, that's another place we need to be honest and rigorous and realistic about. And with that, I'd like to take some questions. Okay. Turn it back to Mark.
Switch myself on here. Thanks a lot, Frank. Appreciate that analysis of the different strategies. Let me ask a couple of questions in my prerogative as the chair here, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But my first question is about continuities and discontinuities with the Obama administration. If we were to have a Clinton or a Trump, where would you see the continuities and where would you see the discontinuities? Recognizing there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly what either of them would do. And I'll start on this end, but we'll move down to Jim. Alex?
Sure. It's actually kind of hard. There was a lot of people who believed that Hillary Clinton, by virtue of being Obama's Secretary of State, would have almost the exact same foreign policy that you would essentially get Obama, President term 3. And it's not that clear cut. I mean, Trump, in terms of his reticence to kind of get abroad and have sort of a grander strategy, is somewhat the same as Obama's instincts, although very different in its execution. And very different in its way about getting there. And I should say, really, and I didn't say this in my earlier remarks, I've had the distinct honor and horror of reading all of Trump's books. And if you go all the way back to the 1980s, when sort of his first book started to appear, he mentions the exact same things he's talking about right now. Getting out of NATO. Weirdly has a problem with Japan. All this kind of stuff. I mean, this is a very consistent worldview. The problem is he has no policies and no coherent way to get to the world he wants to see. And my namesake, I work at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. General Scowcroft tells us all the time, strategy is getting from where you are to where you want to go. So Trump knows he wants to go to the 19th century, fine. But no idea on how to get there. But at least the instinct about not intervening and not being involved in the world too much and moderating America's presence, that's at least an Obamian instinct. And so what does that mean in terms of continuity and discontinuity? The instinct will remain, however, the policies will change quite drastically. When it comes to Clinton, it's definitely a bit beyond Obama in terms of willingness to engage and willingness to intervene, but I think she will double down on alliance management, and I think she will actually have that same mindset that she had as Secretary of State. When she came in, her job was to repair America's image with the world, and I think she feels she will now be the steward of maintaining America's alliances and making sure that they're okay. And I think she'll follow that as well, and so I'm going to steal Fred Kaplan's formulation. For her, it's going to be Obama plus a little bit. Probably a little bit more desire to use the military tool, a little bit more openly, more desire to engage with allies and make it very clear how committed we are with allies. So actually, you're not going to see that much different from the Obamian mindset, but you're going to see, depending on who wins, a different in the way we achieve those worldviews.
Right?
As it's articulated, I think Alex has got it right. It's the multilateralism of the engagement of perhaps the Clinton administration, if that was to come about through the election. That would be, I think, the continuity from an Obama to a Clinton administration. And the big discontinuity, if Mr. Trump would come in, would be this unilateral aspect. I actually think that Mr. Obama is not, or Mr. Trump is not a global competitor, because he's not going to be as global, and he's not exactly an engager, obviously, since he's much more unilateral. So the best description I have for the Trump administration, which I think would be this discontinuity in all forms on the engagement level. And it's a strategy I call Moneyball, which is something I stole from Ian Bremmer's book, Superpower, where he laid out 3 choices. Indispensable America, which some people think Mrs. Clinton is, but I think she's a little more selective than that. And there's an independent America, which sounds a little bit closer to Mr. Trump, that an America that is economically, diplomatically, and military autarkic here in the United States. It's only concerned with its own borders and perhaps its own interest. This Moneyball aspect is a transactional relationship about what's in our interests and how we get the most out of a deal. It's a very negotiated, a very transactional kind of a strategy, and I think that fits Mr. Trump's personality and most of his rhetoric. So it's case by case, it's negotiated, it's very transactional, as opposed to a projection of a universal strategy that's applied consistently over time. So it'd be hard for people to read. And that would be very discontinuous for people who are used to us wanting to lead, wanting to be engaged, wanting to be influential and work through a variety of institutions. So it's a much more bilateral thing. I think that's a big discontinuity.
Jim?
I think however much any new president wants to move in a different direction and apply the campaign slogans and impulses that emerged over the previous year before they come into power, there are always just going to be hard limits on how far they can go in a new direction. Almost like Cancian sticky prices and wages, American foreign policy is really sticky. It doesn't change overnight. And so if you think historically back to the end of the Cold War, George H.W. Bush came to power. He really wanted to focus on the soft landing of the Soviet Union. But Saddam Hussein had other plans. Bill Clinton came in and said it's the economy's stupid. But at the same time, the United States really can't move away from its global leadership position. It has this burden that it has to bear. And so the strategy kind of evolves into one of enlargement and engagement. George W. Bush comes into power and says, we're not going to do nation building. We go off on a massive nation building process.
In months.
And then, Barack Obama comes in, and it's the repudiation of the previous administration's policies on Iraq during the campaign. But lo and behold, it comes in, Guantanamo is not going to close down. A lot of the protectionist rhetoric from the campaign gives way to a president who actually endorses TPP. For all the talk of global zero, we end up starting to modernize our nuclear forces. And so I'm just really struck by, we can get hung up on the campaign rhetoric, but there's been kind of this continuity in American foreign policy for quite some time. All of that said, I would say this time around, I think we might actually be at an inflection point. Because it's not a debate of Republicans versus Democrats, but I think it's much more fundamental. You see the president in his Atlantic interview a few months back talking about his frustration with the foreign policy establishment. You see advisors to Bernie Sanders talking about the need for a different approach. And certainly with Donald Trump, you've seen that. So I don't think it's one where it's simply one candidate or another that's an outlier, but I think that there is some general questioning. And I have to say, from my own perspective, I think there's just an enormous amount of complacency when it comes to the foreign policy establishment, that there's so many things that are very complicated, and so the default answer is always just to leave them be and defend the status quo. And I think we're in one of those periods where we're going to have to spin the Rubik's Cube of the world a lot harder to try to make sense of it. And I think we're going to have to go back to fundamental assumptions about what we're trying to do. And as Frank was saying earlier, there's this tendency to say everything's important. I want to look out for my veterans. I want to maintain the best personnel. I want to increase spending. I don't want to use my military as much. Blah 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 blah. But I think we're going into a period where we're going to have to make unbelievably hard choices. And I think some of them are going to be rather fundamental. I mean, are we going to keep the services that we have today? Are we still going to have an all-volunteer force in the future? Are we still going to have alliances? And so I think we're coming up on some really big fundamental questions. And I don't think that either candidate so far has even begun to address them.
Thank you. Why don't we open up to the floor here, and I have a bunch more questions I'd like to ask, but I know you probably have some questions of your own, so we'll move out to the floor. Okay, well, Ray, you're right up in front.
Okay. Ray Dubois, CSIS. Sir. The title of the report is Alternative Defense Strategies for Cost-Capped Environment. None of you have addressed the role of Congress in this environment that we're about to enter into, not just the campaign environment, but the post-inauguration environment. And it seems to me that whether it's Trump or Clinton, and whether it's one party in charge of the White House, another party in charge of Congress, one or both houses, there is clearly, in my view, an impediment, shall we say, to what either presidential candidate may wish to see happen, may wish to do once they become president, by virtue of the role of Congress. Yes, we all recognize that power has exceeded over the last 40 years to the executive. But I sense that that might be not necessarily reversing but certainly stabilizing from the point of view of what, especially the defense and foreign policy, armed services committees, foreign relations committees, may want to play in this role, their role, both in terms of authorizing, but especially in terms of appropriating. So could the panel address that balance beam issue in this regard?
I'll start. It's one of the realities of our government system and strategic culture that Congress gets to reflect the will of the American people in some sense. I would suggest that in my comments about the defense reform debate, that Congress remains more of a barrier than an accelerator of change, and is part of the complacency of retaining the old in terms of bases, installations, roles, missions that have accreted over time. I don't see it as an accelerator of change, although there are members, significant members in the Senate and the House leadership that are trying to do that. But in the sense that it constrains a normally strong executive style of foreign policy, which is what we have accreted over time over the last 30 years, too strong for some people. In terms of changing the establishment, changing priorities or implementation, that's true. So administrations come in with grand schemes, and then they get this break of reality. Mr. Trump, I think, has some learning to do about what that reality will be in terms of what you can do, what military operations, what treaties you can walk away with, what obligations we have made from previous administrations that either have to be lived up with or walked away from with Congress's permission and authority. So the nuclear modernization issues, withdrawing from alliance agreements, these are breaks on any aggressive or any significant shifts. So it's going to take time if anybody's going to make a change, and it depends on which houses we end up with, if there's any shift in the Congress. I'm not anticipating any right now, but that'll be a precursor whether an administration gets to accelerate its change agenda faster or not. But yeah, it's a reality.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the U.S. has done really well historically in periods in terms of crafting strategy and in terms of our approach in the world, and how we've honed our military during periods of national consensus across the executive and legislative branches. We had a pretty clear idea what the threat was and what we were trying to accomplish. We've actually done pretty well. I think we're in a period where we're really floundering. There is no national consensus today. And I think until that's achieved, we're going to continue to flounder. Ultimately, it's going to get down to questions like what's more important, dealing with China or dealing with ISIS within Syria. Who do you want to kill first? Do you want to go after ISIS, or do you want to go after the Iranians or Assad, or do you want to keep the Russians out? And we just don't have clarity on these issues. And so I think that's something that doesn't come from a committee, that comes from a leader. I think somebody actually has to articulate a reasonable strategic case that others can get behind. So I don't know when that's going to happen. I don't know if it's one of the current presidential candidates that's going to articulate that, but I think that's what's needed if we're really going to make some progress.
I'll quickly add, in my opening comments, I mentioned that Trump's going to want to increase the military and will actually have the political backing to do it, but will actually be unable, or actually will be more unwilling to actually use that tool. And Clinton will want to increase the military, will actually not have the congressional and political backing to do so, even though she'll want to use it. So we're already going to have that mismatch. And of course, this somewhat assumes, depending on what's going on in the Senate, whether it flips or not. I agree with Frank, I don't think it's going to flip. But that's sort of the X factor right now, and but all things being equal, I think that's somewhat the formulation. Looking at these strategies really quickly, it's very hard to imagine that the U.S. will have, I'm agreeing with my colleagues here, will have the ability to select and pick its area that it really wants to focus on. It will give more attention to others. But there will be, this is the United States, there will be a moment where something happens and the U.S. will not have the political ability to just pick and choose and do what it wants to do. No matter who's in office, they're going to be pressed hard to deal with all the challenges that rise up. Now, that depends on who the leader is, on what they're actually going to engage in. But the pull and from Congress and from the American people, despite this populist moment, will still be a bit in global engagement, although probably a little bit less. And so then it all comes down to what our congressional leaders and committee chairmen and our president eventually say, it's worth investing here, it's not worth investing here, it's worth going there, not going there. And that, regardless, the instinct of we need to do everything is going to exist because the enemy gets a vote.
Okay, yeah, right there.
Pat Towell, CRS. Following up on Frank's observation, and I've spent my professional life dealing with Congress as a reporter and now as a staffer, so you apply the appropriate discount that I've gone native on them. But a barrier, take compensation costs. The Compensation Commission coughs out its report, and all of my erstwhile colleagues in the fourth estate immediately say, oh, never happened, straight line extrapolation, MOA, 800-pound gorilla, blah, 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 blah. Well, as a matter of fact, a fair bit of it has happened and is happening. Non-trivial change in the retirement system is now law. We've held the base pay raise down to ECI minus 0.5%. Something seems to be underway on BAH. Strangely enough, the most resilient part of the whole old system seems to be commissaries. And TRICARE. There's all sorts of important stuff going on potentially in TRICARE in this year's NDAA. They don't jump every time some bunch of the usual 100 graybeards say here's the road ahead, but they're not idiots. And it seems to me that they're willing. And if you look at the pieces that are being dickered over right now in the 17 NDAA conference on organization of the department, on security cooperation assistance, that's non-trivial stuff. I don't know how it's going to come out. That's why they call it a conference committee. But it does seem to me, given the complexity of the questions, and Jim has laid them out there, there are chasms we're going to have to jump over or jump into. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that they deserve quite the cavalier treatment that I thought I sensed in Frank's comment.
Yeah, maybe I can double down. Can you put a dollar amount to the 1,700 pages of the NDA?
God save me, I have. Yeah.
I'm dealing with a dollar issue in the delta, not the degree of work or the effort that went into the bill. But I'm looking for a $20 to $30 billion a year delta from overhead reductions, excessive force capabilities. I'm looking for investment capital. I don't see it coming out of the personnel reform. It was supposed to be income neutral. It was advertised by such from the commission leaders and Dov Zakheim and others. It wasn't I think it was an inflection point in growth, but it wasn't a dramatic shift. And part of that was, I think, maybe a benefit of Congress's influence because they didn't want to see soldiers, sailors, airmen, and coasties become the bill payer for the R&D or for the strategy shifts that some people want to make. But I don't think it's had the significant change. It's just been an inflection point. I'm sure there's some very, very good aspects of the bill that are necessary. They're just buried in the 1,700 pages of single-spaced, text. But in terms of perhaps if you've also read, Mr. Carter's 17-page, letter of rebuttal and heartburn, there's a lot of micromanagement and details in there that are probably more of a handcuff than they are an accelerator of change and giving the secretary more agility to manage his own business. Changing names on door signs and telling who reports to who is a level of detail I know Congress likes to get into. I don't find it very helpful.
Rather like requiring that the 6 frigates built for the Navy in the 1794 Navy Act will be built in different ports and this is the wording, to distribute the benefits thereof. It's not exactly novel, Frank.
No, but that's not micromanagement. I think that's just good politics.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, Megan Doherty-Myers from Avocent. My question is for you, Jim. You mentioned in your opening remarks that a new division of labor is required among the U.S. and its allies, and I was hoping that you could add a layer of specificity in your mind. Sure. What does that look like?
So if you think back over the past 25 years, the United States has spent a lot of time encouraging all of its allies in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere to go on out-of-area expeditionary operations with us because we needed them for political legitimacy. they played very minor roles in operations in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, or refueling U.S. military ships as they transit the Indian Ocean, things like that. My argument would be that we don't really have much to show for that. That here we are 25 years later, we have a bunch of allies that think that they got all of this political capital in the bank vis-a-vis Washington because of all these cool expeditionary operations they went off on, and that they're wrong. You know, that I don't think most American taxpayers and people actually remember and value the contributions that our allies have made over the last 25 years, however important those actually were. And at the same time, a lot of these states neglected fundamental territorial defense responsibilities. They assumed that their alliance with the United States was so strong that how could anyone dream of challenging it? But there are countries and actors out there that in fact are. And so I think as we look ahead in Asia and in Europe and elsewhere, the sine qua non has to be territorial defense. It has to be the ability of our allies to protect, defend their own sovereignty, their sovereign territory, their airspace, their cyberspace, and their adjoining waters. To do this, I think they can take a page from some of our rivals. They can develop their own miniaturized anti-access and area denial complexes, particularly focused on the area denial piece, using both short and long-range SAMs for air defense, developing coastal defenses with anti-ship cruise missiles to protect their coasts. They can get back into the landmine business, but there are things they can do to harden themselves as targets so that they're less vulnerable to aggression. At the same time, I think we want our allies to put more money into their resiliency and their ability to hold out. We don't want any potential aggressor to be able to present either our allies or ourselves with a fait accompli, where they can roll over someone so quickly and force them to capitulate long before we're able to arrive at the scene. So the allies in this division of labor really become the first responders. They've got to have the juice on day one to be able, one, to deter attacks, but if war nevertheless comes, they've got to be able to resist long enough that we can get into the game. At the same time, what does the U.S. do? And I think there are a couple things. One is we're the global surveillance and strike guys. We do it like nobody else on the planet. And so that's our differentiator as a superpower, and one I think we want to keep. Our ability to deliver effects globally, whether they're nuclear, conventional, or non-kinetic, remains a distinguishing factor, and it's one that our allies will seek out for deterrence. At the same time, it's the United States that is in the best position to continue controlling the so-called global commons. And it's not just the interests of the United States that are at stake when it comes to the global commons, but it's indeed all of our allies and trading partners. In fact, they may have an even greater stake in maintaining those vital arteries around the world than even the United States does. So I think that becomes increasingly a deal. How do we maintain the most viable elements of our own power projection capabilities to penetrate into contested or denied areas, while helping our allies to develop their own miniaturized denied or contested areas to stop or to slow intra-regional power projection that could be presented by a variety of adversaries. And at the same time, how do we keep the global system functioning and protected through what's likely to be a very volatile couple decades ahead?
Thanks. Let me look over on this side here, with the lady right there.
Good morning, Sita Santi, State Department. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the tools that would be used to implement any of the 5 strategies that you've mentioned, specifically drawing some of the tensions out between traditional security assistance tools available at my home agency, the State Department, vice some of the new, somewhat competing tools for security cooperation within the NDAA.
Frank, you want to?
I haven't gotten into the tools part of the NDA. I've been dealing with the positive aspects of acquisition reform, and then the personnel reform in detail. So I'm not as familiar with the tools. Just kind of picking up on Jim's comments a little bit, I hearken back to days when General Jones was at SACEUR, and we were trying to get our allies to be more expeditionary and to leave their territorial defense. And if they had hearkened and listened to that as much as we would wanted them to, they probably would have been able to be more effective initially in Afghanistan, because they did work out of area, and they did deploy, and they did come, and many of them bled and died. And if we could, I think, put it in the aggregate, it's a rather significant contribution to Afghanistan that we, I think, in America have not enumerated or articulated enough. I think we do at NATO understand that, but I would say that part of the problem today with the territorial defense issue is they listened to us too much, and then we took them to Afghanistan, and now they've come back, and they have to make a period of adjustment. And that adjustment is difficult right now because of 2008. They had the same financial crisis and austerity budgets that have altered, I think, the security investment capital that's available in Europe. But the EU is now back pretty much in 2015, where it was in 2007. But defense spending overall is about 15% below where it was in constant dollars in 2007. So our NATO and EU allies do need to recover. They do need a focus. I agree totally with Jim on both the territorial integrity and the homeland security aspect, both the hardening and the internal resilience on the counterintelligence, counterpropaganda, some of the gray aspects in their own countries that some protagonists in Europe like to project into other people's countries. So that's the tools. Roughly, I think, circa 2010 or 2012, when we wanted to get away from irregular warfare, and we were building partnership capacity for places in Asia and South Asia and Central Asia and Middle East for things we no longer wanted to do. And now the change, and I agree with Jim's strategy, is building partnership capacity is about helping allies enhance their own defense to do things we have to do together. That includes, I think, a division of labor, what I call the division of labor. That's my term, not Jim's. But this notion of what we contribute and what they contribute has to be worked out together collaboratively in some of our NATO planning and some other organizations we have. But I agree totally with Jim's presentation, the shift. But I think we took them there, and we have to be a little bit acknowledging of that. And it's going to take some time to readjust their defense priorities. But they definitely need to up the game. And if you look at what NATO's done, I think just in the last 2 years between Wales and Warsaw, the inflection point's been I think, taken in, abetted by Mr. Putin's aggressiveness, as everybody gets the message now. And I think we've seen the end of the decline, but there's still a long way to go to bring that back up to where it should be. And Jim's strategy, I think, is the right one, particularly in Europe, but it's also, I think, equally true in Asia.
Thanks for the question. A lot of times when we talk about building partner capacity, we talk about it at the low end in terms of building capacity for counterinsurgency and foreign internal defense and things like that. That's very important, but I think security cooperation is likely to be an increasingly growing and important facet in our strategy in the years ahead, and it has to be radically expanded. If we want our allies to have area denial systems, we're going to have to really rethink our export policies. We have to rethink ITAR restrictions. We're going to have to rethink some of our arms control arrangements, things like MTCR, for a radically different sort of world. The other problem is that if you think about those systems, the United States actually, our U.S. industry is not really in the business of developing a lot of those systems. And where we have systems, they're really not cost competitive relative to other international systems that are out there. So the U.S. military has been in the expeditionary power projection and domain control business now for many decades. That's what U.S. industry builds. They build the systems that allow us to do that. If we're talking now about going into an era where it's more about denying domains, then either U.S. industry is going to have to adapt and start producing those area denial systems, those domain denial systems that our allies and, quite frankly, we ourselves are going to need in the future, or we're going to have to get them from foreign sources. But I think that this is the real challenge going forward.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and there's a hand back up there.
Hi, Skylar Moore with Renaissance Strategic Advisors. I'd like to go back to acquisition reform and cost cutting very quickly. So you brought up Ash Carter's letter, and one of the main issues, or not one of the main ones, but one of the issues he brought up was BRACs. And the services have constantly brought that up. And we've talked about it more generally here, but I would like to tie it back to the candidates more specifically of whether you think that they will push specifically for BRACs or even acquisition reform back down to the undersecretaries, and where they will fall on cost-cutting measures, and if you think that they will prioritize specific cost-cutting measures over others.
Alex, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's really, BRAC, I don't really think it's high on the minds of either of the candidates right now. For Clinton, I'm sure it will take a backseat to many of other priorities, and I think Trump probably thinks it's a property that he has yet to develop. So I think it's a little, it's a niche issue, but it's an important issue. I just don't think they're going to get reform, especially when you have Clinton, who will have trouble even getting more money in the defense space. And actually, just a bit back to the last question, at a 30,000-foot level, I think if you get a Clinton presidency, you're going to see a lot more in the State Department and the USAID budget relative to the DoD budget, which will actually change the game. And I actually think you would see more in her administration a closer correlation between the national security strategy and the QDDR than you actually would between the NSS and a QDR-like document. So all this to say is that if she's not going to have the kind of money to really even think about BRAC or even really pay that much attention to it, or even, and by that I mean when she's actually going to pay attention to DoD, it's not going to be top of mind. And it might be a cost-saving measure, but who knows? And when you go with Trump, it'll just be to the services and making them bigly, or however he likes to comment on them. So I would be very cautious, or at least pessimistic on the notion of BRAC and reform.
Yeah, I'm very pessimistic on the notion, having been up on the Hill lots of times in the last 2 years, and there's very little appetite for paying the near-term pain politically for getting something closed in your district for the longer-term gain. I think the longer-term gain is very clear. There are several billions of dollars being spent maintaining buildings and properties that contribute zero to national defense today, much less in the future. But making that realignment is really difficult. Some of that comes from the data from the last BRAC series, where we spent a lot more money on realignment and building new wonderful facilities, and very little on the closure and the reduction. And so the evidence is pretty overwhelming in the longer term about the benefits of BRAC. But the near-term pain and the long-term payoff is just kind of a non-starter politically. So I'm very pessimistic that you'll see some of those kinds of things. And I don't think it's Congress's fault. It's just, one of the realities of politics is that all politics are local, and it's going to feed back into people's decision cycle.
I'm going to be a little more optimistic than Frank, although Frank's pessimism is well-founded. You're certainly not going to hear anything about BRAC during the election, because there's no upside and there's always a lot of downside. Now, once you have a new administration come in, essentially the cards are thrown up in the air. I know that the department has thought about some different approaches to BRAC, restructuring the language to try to reduce congressional concerns. So I think that there's a possibility in a new administration, but that's about all we can say at this point. And on that note of minor optimism, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future CSIS events.
How's life? Good. Things are well.